Veganism and vegetarianism are often a dietary reflection of people's concern for the treatment of animals. To many people, veganism is a full-on ideology regarding the treatment of animals. There is no doubt that veganism and vegetarianism, as well as the treatment of animals as an issue, are important matters which are worthy of serious discussion. Here my aim is to outline my own views on the broad range of issues that is veganism, vegetarianism, and the treatment of animals. Keep in mind that when I say veganism and vegetarianism, I am talking solely of the beliefs associated to the treatment of animals, and not veganism and vegetarianism for other reasons such as health or religion. As this is a broad issue, I at first found it difficult to find a way to adequately describe my thoughts on these issues. I decided that I would share my thoughts on these issues in the format of answering a range of questions on the subject matter that people may have. My aim here is to summarize. These issues are very important and cannot be fully explained in one video. I recommend you look at a range of perspectives from a range of people on these issues. Now to begin the questions. Question 1. Is the treatment of animals a serious issue? It is a fact that many animals are treated with unspeakable cruelty. I think that the treatment of animals is undeniably poor and is absolutely a very serious issue. I do not like sentient beings suffering and feeling pain. Violence against these beings is also a gateway to violence against humans. Because the left largely bases itself on an opposition to exploitation and oppression, I think we should absolutely take the poor treatment of animals seriously and work to improve the standards of living for these creatures. How can we say we oppose oppression and exploitation if we don't have any issue with things like factory farming, that are the epitome of these evils? The treatment of animals is a serious issue, and any decent and informed person should be able to realize this. Question 2. Do consumers have a moral obligation to go vegan? I do not think consumers have a moral obligation to become vegan. I think placing moral blame on consumers is a mistake. It is virtually impossible for consumers to be able to make fully moral consumption decisions. You may have heard the phrase, "there is no ethical consumption under capitalism." Consumers are by design distanced from the harm behind products and cannot be expected to take blame for the atrocities committed by capitalists. Moral accountability falls on those selling products and profiting off of pain and suffering. I think ultimately these problems will be solved by the systemic changes at a larger level, not by individual choices. These cruel industries cannot be abolished by vegan dietary activism alone, because most people either cannot or will not become vegan, and companies selling animal goods will do anything to continue selling these products. While I do not think consumers have an obligation to go vegan or to go vegetarian or to make any ethical buying decisions, I think that if they have the opportunity to, they should. If they have the means to do it, I think this is a good thing for them to do to lessen the suffering in the world. Doing so can be seen as an act of charity and compassion, aimed at reducing harm until a systemic solution can be implemented. It is similar to how I do not think it is morally wrong to not donate to charity. I think if you can, you should, but you are not morally obligated to. Basically, I don't think people are immoral if they are not vegan. I do, however, think that if you are being a responsible consumer, it is always a good thing to try to make responsible buying decisions here and there if you can. This does reduce harm, and it is a form of activism. I just don't think it's a moral obligation. Question 3. How do we prevent animal abuse? Preventing animal abuse comes down to 4 major points for me. They are the following. Point 1. Systemic changes. Systemic changes such as new laws and regulations are in my mind the most essential way of preventing animal abuse. Government oversight and legal penalties for wrongdoing go a long way to preventing immoral activity. Such laws would try to ensure animals live in humane conditions while in captivity and are killed in the most humane way possible. Laws would be progressive and built up over time to improve the treatment of animals gradually to a degree where animals would be treated in a way far better than they are today, to the point that it would be unrecognizable from modern animal industries. As usual, these laws and reforms to the system would be pushed by activists and political parties to make a strong and long-lasting change. Point 2. Social changes. A second important change that needs to take place is what I call social change. Social change takes place in society and would look like people being less tolerant of the idea of animal abuse and more willing to condemn animal cruelty. You may think that society is already unfriendly towards these things, and to some degree you are correct. Society will quickly condemn the abuse of a cute puppy, but defense of the meat industry and the torture it subjects upon uglier animals is still common. Ideally, in society, ideas such as factory farming and all manner of other cruel farming practices would be viewed as indefensible. Those who defend factory farms would be looked on in a similar way to those who defend historical atrocities. An environment in which animal abuse is tolerated to a lesser extent would decrease the social acceptability of such abuse, leading to its inevitable extinction, or at least its occurrence far less often. This would also be useful for mobilizing voters to lead to systemic change. Point 3. Dietary activism. Dietary activism such as veganism and vegetarianism are a valid form of harm reduction. If you can do these things, you should, to reduce the harm that is done to animals before a stronger systemic solution can be arranged. Dietary activism is not to be underestimated and is a tool for harm reduction. As I say, I do not believe it is a moral obligation, but I think if you can, you should try to do it, at least to some extent. Point 4. Other activism. Other activism describes things such as protests, investigations, and all of that other sort of shame campaigns, you could call them. An important part of progressing the treatment of animals is exposing the crimes of animal industries and publicly shaming them for it. This kind of activism is a good way of creating public relations nightmares for companies that commit egregious crimes. This kind of activism is an important tool for reducing animal cruelty and putting a little extra pressure onto animal industries to behave themselves a little. Question 4. How is the moral worth of animals assessed? In order to say animal abuse is bad, we need to be able to argue that animals have moral worth. I think that any sentient being that can perceive pain, physical or psychological, is worthy of some moral consideration. Some argue only people are worthy of moral consideration. I think this worldview is itself immoral, as it is okay with the suffering of other creatures, something that I think is unacceptable, and any respectable moral system should oppose for a range of reasons. Others argue that all sentient beings are worthy of equal moral consideration. I take issue with this approach too, as I think it is reductive and fails to take into account what I would call a moral hierarchy of sentience. The moral hierarchy of sentience is a tool which assesses the moral worth of creatures based on a range of factors relating to their sentience. Most of these factors include the ability of a being to perceive physical or psychological pain and to what degree this pain can exist. We have tools that can help us do this. I would argue that taking into account a number of factors is important in our ability to choose where we put creatures on a hierarchy. Beings on different levels of the hierarchy are worthy of different rights and treatment standards in accordance to their ability to suffer and other potential factors. A basic idea of such a moral hierarchy would have people at the top followed with smart animals such as pigs and dogs, which would then be followed by dumber creatures such as chickens, which would then be followed by insects, which would themselves be followed by other creatures which are basically incapable of perceiving serious pain. The hierarchy would require much nuance and would have to be put together carefully through scientific, ethical, and philosophical considerations. For now, we must rely on more crude versions, such as the basic outline I gave above. All animals on the hierarchy are worthy of some moral consideration. How much is decided by their place on the hierarchy. The moral hierarchy is my personal preference for assessing the moral worth of animals. Question 5. Personally, do you take into account the treatment of animals with your dietary decisions? Yes, I do. Where I can, I try to engage in harm reduction through my consumption decisions. I am mostly a vegetarian and plan on going vegan eventually. I say mostly a vegetarian because I think in some cases eating meat is completely fine. In my country there are animals such as deer that are pests, which have no predators and are damaging the forests. Hunters have to kill them to keep them under control. Because they have to die for the good of native animals, I think eating the meat of these creatures is completely justified. In fact, you could argue that getting something out of their remains rather than just letting them rot is probably a good thing to do in these unfortunate cases where pests must be culled. Anyway, that concludes the video. I hope you found my answers to the questions satisfactory and insightful. If you have any more questions, feel free to leave them in the replies, and I might even do a follow-up video if you are lucky.